Sentry mode activated. Target acquired.
Hey there hunters, and welcome back to the Old Gunners Guild. So the topic of today's discussion isn't solely revolved around Gunner, it's a topic that actually involves everyone. So with patch 2.0 out, our armor set to improved quite a bit. We also got some new weapon upgrades, so a lot of builds have been going around, and that's just fine and dandy. But I'm here to kind of rain on the parade, because that's what I do, and obviously explain why brutal strikes and negative crits are bad. If it wasn't obvious, yeah, negative crits are bad, but why is brutal strikes bad? So let's start with how brutal strike works. Now, selecting the rampage skill Brutal Strikes will give your weapon a chance to do increased damage with negative affinity attacks. Now what this means is that there's a 1 in 4 chance that whenever you were to inflict a negative crit, you'll, rather than dealing 25% less damage, you're going to be dealing 1.5 times damage. Technically this is double damage, but you're doubling a 0.75 times modifier, so it's only 1.5 times. But yeah. So obviously we'd want negative crits to make use of this skill. Unfortunately, the weapons with this skill typically have around minus 15 to minus 20% affinity. I mean, there are some special cases that like minus 25 and minus 30, but 30 is like the limit. Now putting brutal strikes on these doesn't even net you back neutral damage, which is the funny part. You're still worse off than just having 0 affinity across the board. Again though, this doesn't sound so bad on paper still, because basically almost effectively being able to ignore all your negative affinity is pretty solid, but trust me, there's still more problems. So most of like the Tigrex weapons have an average of about minus 20% affinity, which with brutal strike still puts you 2% under having no affinity in terms of your damage output. And these weapons typically have solid other rampage skill options in the form of, more affinity or more raw. And funny enough that your lower negative affinity makes it actually worse, because all you're kind of doing is still negating part of that for negative crits. I mean, you're not actually getting more damage out of it. So I mean, it's just bad altogether. So the other problem with brutal strikes is that we have no way of lowering our affinity. Now unlike older Monster Hunter games who can actually get negative critical eye, now Rise has no such systems for that, so we can't really build around brutal strikes at all. The best you can do is just avoid affinity skills and just stack raw. And again, it's not a bad option on paper, but there's only like one reliable raw skill, which is just attack boost. Other skills like peak, performance, resuscitate, and resentment are all conditional, and you can't really stack peak and resentment. Now agitator provides crit, so that's a no-go. But say that even if that was the case, and we could put points into negative critical eye and have like a negative 50% crit with brutal strikes, you're still overall lowering your damage output from, base 0% affinity, and now you're investing points to do it. Like, there would have to be some crazy raw gains to justify having brutal strikes. Like if Rampage could get like attack surge to get like plus 20 raw and minus 30% affinity and then grab brutal strikes, then okay, we'd be talking. And actually now that I say that out loud, I'm kind of surprised that's not a thing. Like why isn't that a thing? That would be so cool for Rampage weapons. But anyway, as it stands right now, lowering your crit would not help either. Speaking of crit, it's just too easy to stack crit in the first place, which is the other problem for brutal strikes. Weakness exploit, crit boost, agitator, crit eye, maximize latent power. I mean, there's a ton of ways to scale your crit, and it's just so much easier to do so. Let's go back to like the whole Tigrex weapon thing. Like if you had a negative 20% affinity weapon and just had brutal strikes on it, or you could choose the affinity augment and have like negative 12% affinity instead, you're pretty much going to be doing effectively the same damage output without gimping yourself into avoiding critical skills. Like, we have so many great critical pieces now anyway, like Teostra's Crown, the gloves, Ingot legs, Kadachi legs, Narc chest, eye patch, stuff like that, that trying to avoid some of these better, like, optimized pieces just to make a niche skill that also relies on RNG to function, it's just kind of silly. Especially when you consider how easy it is to just throw on a point of weakness exploit and just completely demolish having brutal strikes altogether. So all these weapons with brutal strikes, just kind of ignore it. Slap on affinity to offset the negative crit, or put in more raw and throw in, a point of weakness exploit, and you're pretty much going to be better off than trying to build for negative crits. The only reason why you would ever even consider negative crits is if you're doing like some TDS memes where you want to do the largest damage number, which would probably need to run negative crits because the 1.5 damage multiplier is still better than crit boost 1.4 times. Then you gotta fish for those low percent chance for that to occur, and that's just gonna be a fucking nightmare. But yeah, you definitely just stack raw in that case. But other than that, no reason to run brutal strikes. So that's basically all for me. I hope I got the point across. Brutal strikes are bad. Anyway, thank you all for watching, and good luck out there, hunters, and whatever you may be hunting.